And then from there we go to the Affairs of State. And Affairs of State is, in my mind, one of the more successful galleries because we've divided into two parts. You enter, as the audience, into this great vista of the throne room. Here in Mobile, the length of the throne room has been shortened. It's not as long as it was in Wilmington. And the way you enter it from the church gallery is such that as soon as you turn into that gallery, you bump into the throne. I mean, it's that intimacy, it draws you. And so you feel that you're in the presence of Nicholas. Having visited that room, you then make another turn and you get to see his study. And it is an architectural, intentional play on contrasts. Nicholas, the public figure ruling an empire from a throne. Nicholas, the bureaucrat running his empire from a desk that's really no bigger than most tabletops that most of us work off of, and he did that without a gopher, without a secretary. So you really get to see how a man is ruling an entire empire that comprises 1/7 of the world's landmass all by himself, reading all of his memos, annotating all of his memos. It's really a wonderful, wonderful contrast. Then from there we go into the military 11. And the military gallery is interesting. There's uniforms and there's the parade swords and there's portraits and you get to meet the personalities. The most interesting one, I guess, is a man by the name of Nicholas Nikolaevich, the same first name as the emperor. And he was the commander-in-chief of the Russian forces during World War I, and Nicholas decided to replace him. That was the one time that Nicholas was decisive in his life, but that decisiveness cost him his popularity, because having demoted this general, Nicholas lost all credibility with the general staff. And they all, to a man, urged him to resign. And we actually have the letter in that gallery that Nicholas says, I'm asking you to step down and I am assuming position. And we also have in those galleries the joint telegram that all of his chief of staff signed and said, please step down for the good of the country. And Nicholas then in gallery 11, which we call Arrest and Abdication, does step down. And that gallery is great because that gallery is the first of two, 11, 12, and 13. It's for military's 11. We're going to get into 12, which is arrest and abdication and arrest. And in that gallery, we have the abdication decree. And what's I think is particularly moving about that is Nicholas was always such a wishy-washy, non-decisive kind of a guy that when you look at the abdication decree that he writes, it's signed for 3 o'clock, and in the bottom left-hand corner, everybody that witnesses signs in a kind of like a heavy black magic marker. And Nicholas's signature in the lower right-hand corner is kind of like this very, very wimpy, faint number 4 pencil signature. And my interpretation of that document is that he signed it under duress. He thought that maybe if the political winds changed, he could maybe retrieve it and with a little bit of an eraser, get rid of his name, and the document never occurred. It's unfortunate at that juncture that he was at the front. And you have to also understand that his wife and 5 children are in the Alexandra Palace at Tsarki Selo, which is about 30 miles from St. Petersburg proper. Everyone at Tsarki Selo, his children, were all down with measles. We have records of the period that the lowest temperature, fever temperature of the child was 103 degrees. One of the children had measles and pneumonia. So when the news reached the palace that Nicholas had abdicated, people urged the empress and the children to flee for their lives. But the doctors said that because their condition with measles was so critical, and we know that measles can be an absolutely horrible disease if you don't take care of it, they decided that they would wait until the children were well enough recovered, let's say, to move. But by the time that happened, they were already placed under house arrest. The original justification was to save their lives from the revolutionaries, because if they didn't have a garrison around them, they could have been maybe bumped off by some anarchist. It turns out that the provisional government then doesn't know what to do with them. And that becomes a political hot potato, let's say. Overtures to grant the family asylum gets brushed aside. The Brits, for example, who were experiencing their own kind of labor union resurgence at that time, let's say, thought it would be untoward of them to offer asylum to an individual who had been toppled by the working man. So the offer of asylum that King George V was giving to Nicholas was completely eroded away. And as a result, Lenin comes back in through a treachery through Wilhelm II, the enemy of Russia, the ruler of Germany, and the family is moved from pillar to post. They go from Sorgoselo to Tobolsk, from Tobolsk to Ekaterinburg. And Gallery 13 has the grisly documents of that fateful night, 16-17 July 1918. We have a bloody swath of wallpaper that came off the wall of that room in which they were killed. We have the bayonet, one of the bayonets that was used to stab them to death. And the reason for that was throughout their capture, the women, the mother and the 4 daughters, were afraid that their captors would take their jewelry. So they secretly dismantled their jewels and sewed the precious stones in their underwear, referring to the jewelry as their medicine. And we've got letters and other documents say, have you taken care of your medicine today? Meaning, did you sew another jewel or something in there? When they were marched down that wall on the 16th, 17th of July in that sub-basement and lined up against the wall with one assassin, there was one trigger man for everybody that was going to be knocked off. They stood point blank with their rifles, they shot. And all of a sudden, bullets started to ricochet like a pinball machine all over the room. The reason for it was that the diamonds that had been sewn into the underwear had acted as bulletproof vests, deflecting the bullets from hitting them. It was at that moment that the assassins had to recourse to their bayonets. And they tried to pierce them with the bayonets, and the bayonets at first couldn't go in because the diamonds were so tightly sewn that you still had this girdle of armor. It was only after they succeeded in killing the Tsar's family, this has to be an agonizing death. Being shot, being stabbed, and still refusing to die because your vital organs are not being affected in a sense. So death was prolonged and protracted. It was not instantaneous. It must have been a horror. And then they decided to disrobe the figures so that they could mutilate the bodies and then pour sulfuric acid on it. And it was only when the bodies were disrobed that the 18 pounds of diamonds started to fall out of their garments, and we realized why they were protected. And then in that gallery as well, we have 2 original requisitions for the sulfuric acid that was used to disfigure them before they were thrown into the mine, and we have the actual crockery in which the sulfuric acid was contained that was brought for that thing. So again, as you go through the galleries, that's a downer in terms of the emotional impact that it would have on a sensitive human being. And then Gallery 14, to try to take a little bit of the edge off of the tragedy, we've simply called that gallery Remembering. We have one original photograph album in there, 1913, that shows the family in their salad days, let's say, when things were a little bit better off. And we have 3 videos. One is a compilation that I put together of still photographs, so you can see the family. It's their own photographs that we put on the DVD. The second one is the Russians have very generously shared us home videos that the Russian family took of themselves, and I compiled that again into several vignettes. So you see Alexei at play, you see them dancing on the royal boat, just to give you an idea. And then the third video, again, with the thanks of the Russian Federation, is a distillation of about 18 hours of the funeral that actually took place when the remains were brought back from Ekaterinburg and interred. And that, in a nutshell, is a tour of the